Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. I'm Michael Shifter, the president of the Dialogue, and really thank you so much for joining us. I don't say this with a lot of pride, but this is the Dialogue's first event on smart cities in Latin America. We have highlighted many themes and issues related to the topic, but not smart cities per se. The turnout today is, I suppose, not only a measure of the quality of the sandwiches, but also a keen interest in this crucial topic. And I'm sure this won't be the last event we'll have on smart cities. What prompted this important event was the very interesting and thought-provoking report by the McKinsey Global Institute that came out just a few months ago. I hope everyone has a copy. They're available outside for you to pick up, and there are only 6,000 left, so you better hurry. I want to congratulate Jana Brems, a partner with McKinsey, on this fine report, and also thank her for sending us the copies, and of course for being with us today from her home office in San Francisco. Welcome, and thank you so much. Looking at the list of people here and the organizations they represent, this is clearly a topic that crosses a remarkably wide range of interest and has drawn together stakeholders from governments, corporations, and civil society. This also fits with and reinforces the Dialogue's core mission of convening leaders from different sectors with different perspectives to discuss critical issues and come up with consensus practical solutions. I want to thank the members of the Dialogue's corporate program who are here today, a group of forward-looking companies that make events like this possible through their involvement with the Dialogue. The program is directed by Eric Brand, who's back there, who's done a terrific job and produces a first-rate and highly acclaimed daily publication, the Latin American Advisor, which is our main communication vehicle to the corporate sector. And if you are interested in the corporate program, please talk to Eric. And finally, I want to express my gratitude to our very distinguished speakers who will be introduced by our very distinguished moderator, Lisa Vasidi. As many of you know, Lisa directs the Dialogue's very impressive and dynamic program on energy, climate change, and extractive industries. In recent years, Lisa has done a lot of work on clean technologies and smart transport, with 4 excellent annual conferences in Bogota, Mexico City, San Jose, and the next one is scheduled at the end of this month in Buenos Aires. If anybody is interested in that conference, I encourage you to look at our website to get more information. So welcome to all of you again. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa. Lisa. Thank you, Michael.
Well, I also want to thank my colleague, Eric Brand, for organizing this event and our corporate members for making it possible. The discussion today will focus on the issue of smart cities, and I think one of the issues discussed is what does that mean? How does that apply? What does it mean in the global context, and how does that apply to Latin America? Broadly speaking, smart cities are ones that use technology and communication systems and data to improve operations, efficiency, and the quality of life for their citizens. And I think that one of the key takeaways from the McKinsey Global Institute report that I thought was very interesting is that it shows that higher income countries are further ahead in adopting these types of systems and technologies. And I think it shows that Latin America and the Caribbean as a region really has a long way to go, but it also highlights that there are some cities that are really ahead on certain indicators of smart cities. Some of the cities mentioned are Rio, Medellin, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Santiago. So some of the largest cities, but also some of the middle-sized cities in the region. As Latin America is one of the most urbanized regions in the world, with about 80% of the population living in urban areas. So I think that this shows that there's a lot of opportunity to use these types of technology, data, and communications to improve conditions for the citizens of cities. And I just wanted to point out that here at the dialogue, this issue of cities and smart cities in particular, it really kind of cuts across a lot of the work that we're doing in multiple programs. It intersects, and this is pointed out in the report as well as in other reports that will be shared today. It cuts across energy, transport, issues that I work on, but also education, migration, security challenges. And I think it's an issue that we're looking at from multiple different perspectives, but as Michael said, this is the first time that we'll bring it together in one event. And before I turn it over to the speakers, I want to take an opportunity to plug this report, which is hot off the press, which focuses on electric vehicles, which is a topic that we've looked at a lot in Latin America. And in this case, we actually look specifically at certain cities. So it really overlaps with some of the discussion that we'll have today. So I'll introduce our panelists in the order that they'll speak. Yana Remes is an economist and a partner at McKinsey Global Institute. She's going to present the findings of their Smart Cities report, which we have copies of here. And she also has worked on other research. She's led McKinsey's work for over 15 years on issues like demographics, productivity, competitiveness, and growth around the world. Mauricio Bosquella is a senior specialist in the competitiveness and innovation division in the Inter-American Development Bank. He's Brazilian, a native of Sao Paulo. And before joining the IDB, he was also at Intel, so he also has some specific sector expertise. Guillermo Areas is head of government and external affairs for Latin America and the Caribbean at BMW Group. He's originally from Nicaragua and has worked at BMW and other German car companies. Jeffrey Digert is assistant vice president for public policy at AT&T. He's also an attorney, and before AT&T, he worked at the FCC as well as at a private firm. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Yana, and each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you, Dialogue, for indeed being so visionary to bring discussion on smart cities to Latin America. We have worked on cities for 10 years, more than 10 years now, and it actually took us that long to write our first report on smart cities. I do have a mic, but I think, can you hear me now? Good, thank you. So after 10 years, we thought that there's enough data on smart cities. There's pilots and experiments across the globe. So we know a little bit of what smart cities actually can do based on the experience on the ground. And we thought it was a good time for us to take stock and see what's the potential impact of smart cities. And at the same time, take a snapshot of how well cities are doing in deploying that knowledge. And Latin America was, of course, part of our research. And I'll give you some highlights on that briefly. But before that, I would like to go back to what Lisa was just saying. Latin America is actually a region where making cities smarter matters even more than in almost any other region. And the reason is not just that most people already live in cities, 4 out of 5, which is a higher share than anywhere else but North America. In China, it's only about a half. But in addition to that, that urban population is more concentrated in just a few cities. Top 10 cities in their economic power generate a third of Latin American GDP. So full third come from 10 cities, 4 in Brazil, 2 in Mexico, and the rest of other capitals of some of the other cities. And these were all cities that grew very rapidly in the second half of the 20th century during the import substitution period, where everybody wanted to be close to political power. And unfortunately, a lot of the infrastructure and housing and transport did not keep up with the rapid growth. And these cities actually have been a slower growing part of these economies. So smart cities is a way to try to see how these brownfield, very large cities with very large urban challenges can be solved. And the good news is that there's a lot that smart city technologies can do. However, before we start talking about smart cities and what we found, we need to define it, because I assume there is probably as many definitions for smart cities as there are people in this room. The way we think of smart cities is that giving a city's physical and human infrastructure, what can you do by adding a layer of connected smartphones and sensors that collect data from across every agent in the city, or as many as possible, translate that into useful information in apps and platforms that then give people good information to make better decisions. This whole intelligence layer, as we think of it, can help the city perform a lot better than it would without given the physical infrastructure, given the human infrastructure, than if you didn't have that information available. So that means that for us, smart cities is much more than having a technology center or a command operation at the guts of the city. It can be a private sector company who goes after revenue from a new mobility solution, and that gives new ways to get to work for people living in the outskirts of the city. It could be an individual who checks the traffic in their app and decides to wait until it gets lighter, and that way keeps one person or one car less from the roads. Or it can be a city that collaborates with the local healthcare provider to put a sensor of air quality into every inhaler of asthma patients that then provides immediate information to these patients on the quality of air and whether they should be going out. But at the same time, collects that information to the city that can then target some of the most hotspots of pollution, for example. And it is this collection of millions of decisions and changes in actions that allow the city to do better and improve performance, be more productive than they would otherwise be. So what our research was really about was to see, given the evidence that we have had, how much better can cities actually do to their citizens by taking advantage of this intelligence layer. And overall, we found that they can do a lot. Across a broad range of quality of life indicators, we can see improvements from 10 to 30%. So take mobility, for example. In a large developed city with a good metro system, doing things like live information on where the transit is, as well as predictive maintenance of the system so that you reduce the downtime, you can reduce average commute by 15% for everybody in the city. That can translate to roughly 15 minutes a day, for example, for an average commute, one-way commute of 45 minutes, which translates into 2 days of saved time in a year. So that's a massive improvement simply by providing better information and being able to act earlier or differently than you would otherwise. Another example is water, a big challenge for many Latin American cities, for example. And here you can reduce water wasted by 20 to 30%, which can translate into 25 to 80 liters of water per person per day saved in many of these cities. And how to do that depends a little bit of where your problem is. If you have a lot of leaking pipes, it might be sensors that tell you where a leakage is that you can address very quickly. In other places, it may be very wasteful usage by the consumers or the households, in which case you would want to track the metering and provide pricing that incentivizes people to save water. But across the board, there's many examples. We looked at 60 applications across the board and found that you can get improvements literally of 10 to 30%, in some cases even more, to that make a difference. And I think there's a lot more details on the report. Two things to note of these findings. There is really no one specific impact of any smart city solution has. It really does depend on what the city's starting position is. So think of health applications, for example. In a typical high-income neighborhood or city, it's the longer-term lifestyle diseases of, let's say, diabetes or heart disease that are the biggest challenge. And here, the solutions that are most effective tend to be things like at-distance monitoring, video rehab, and things like those that basically maintain some of the lifestyle diseases that are across the board the biggest challenge for health. In low-income cities where it might be some infectious or preventable diseases, tracking where infectious diseases start and addressing them at the point, or simply providing safe sex practice information or targeting mothers with children or pregnant teenagers to make sure that they get the best care they can. And basically that can be a very simple app-based medical advice tool that makes the biggest difference. So you need to really know your city before you know what is the biggest application. And the one thing that was pretty clear we found also is that smart city is not an economic development strategy. It really doesn't make that big of a difference for GDP and jobs as it does for the quality of life. So it really needs to be a solution for the city to become better for its citizen and have the indirect impact on growth. So where do Latin American cities stand in the deployment of the tools that are available? We included 7 cities in our study out of 50 global cities that we looked at. Rio, Sao Paulo, Bogota, Medellin, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Santiago. And we looked at the 3 layers that matter for making cities smart: the technology layer, the applications, and then the satisfaction and usage of the citizens. And what did we find? Latin America was furthest behind in the technology. Not only are there not very many sensors, particularly water and air quality, etc., but the communications, the network speed and access is lower than it is in many other regions. So that is a real constraint. The technology infrastructure really is still lacking. On the applications, there's wide variance. Mobility applications, particularly shared e-hailing, etc., is quite common. There are some, I think, exciting innovations. Rio is well known for some of the safety and security applications. Santiago actually has quite extensive at-distance home healthcare services. So there's exciting things happening across the board, but clearly very broad range of whole still of opportunities. In transit, for example, things like predictive maintenance of public transit fleet, or any tools to reduce the congestion from commercial traffic. Most of those we don't see just about anywhere. And on the satisfaction of and the usage of the citizens, in all of these 50 cities, we surveyed 400 people to see whether they are aware of the applications, the smart city applications, whether they use them, and whether they like them. And there is wide variance on the responses by application and by city, but overall Latin America is roughly in the middle of the global pack. That kind of surprised us because we saw a very clear correlation between age and usage and awareness. And it is European cities are actually surprisingly low in the usage and awareness. They tend to be older cities. Their adoption is lower, while some Asian cities that are young are very much at the top. And we expected Latin American, given the younger population, to be more like that, and they didn't. So there was we were thinking that there would be opportunities for the region to do more. So, very quick snapshot, the 3 takeaways that we took away from that for what this means for Latin America. First, you should be thinking about the smart city strategy for your city. You should be thinking about what are the biggest problems in your city and how smart city solutions, the intelligence layer, can help solve those. So know who you are, know what your problems are, and find a way how the smart solutions can help debottleneck that. Second, in any investment you make, infrastructure or otherwise, make sure you think of how you can bring that intelligence layer, the behavioral changes, making the citizens part of the solution, because that way your investment money is going to go further. You can get more impact from every dollar you invest. And clearly, this is not a business for cities to do alone. It needs to be really an enterprise of almost everyone. Encourage innovation. Look for private sector partners. We estimate that while 70% of the applications today naturally would belong to the city, full 60% of the investment required would actually be made by a private sector with the return. So overall, large opportunities for Latin America, very exciting sparks at different parts of the cities. And I think we are very excitedly looking forward to see where comes the next wave of impact from smartness.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? No. Hello. My mic's on? No? Yes, okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for an invitation for this very important panel here at Smart Cities. I'm from the Inter-American Development Bank, and in the last maybe 6 to 7 years, we have been working with smart cities in Latin America and Caribbean. Based on our experience and everything we know about technology, etc., sometimes we see that smart cities is equal technology. But at the end of the day, it's not technology. We see smart cities as a way to really address the city's problem. By the way we see the smart city, we see in 3 major components. First, territory. Second, technology. And third, institutions. When you look about the territory, we can think about smart cities looking for a small neighborhood near your home or your home. Then you can see the city. You can see the metropolitan area. You can see state. You can see the country. And you can see also the region. For us, smart city in Latin America is a great opportunity. We still have a vision that Latin America can become a region of smart cities. Looking at the territory, we see this territory has a lot of challenges. We know that Latin America has 80% of the people living in urban areas. In the last 65 years, we had like 430 million people moving to the cities, or maybe growing in the city, being born in the cities. So this kind of change really brought a lot of problems for the cities. Space, how do you manage everything? How do you manage disasters? How do you manage security, the mobility, and so on and so on? So we understand in the smart cities, or in the cities in general in Latin America, we are facing several challenges. And those challenges cannot be solved in the traditional way. We need to take these cities for the smart cities. Challenge, for example, security. When you talk about the mayors in Latin America, they say, what's your priority number one? Security, and second, security, third, security. So security is something very important for the short term addressing. People are concerned about security. In Latin America, out of the 50 most violent cities in the world, 42 of them are in Latin American Caribbean. So the numbers for security makes it a very high priority when you look about the challenge facing the city. Second challenge is mobility. The mobility related to congestion, time people take from moving from home to their offices and so on, contamination or pollution, and also fatalities, accidents. So this is one thing also that concerns people and public offices in Latin America. Third one, disaster vulnerability. Our region has a lot of cities that are very close to the coast, very close to rivers, and very vulnerable to natural disasters. For example, in Colombia, 33% of the people are living in an area that's vulnerable to landslide, and 45% to flooding. And we talk about population, nearly 50 million people in Colombia. So that's another problem that for sure concerns everyone. Other problems like energy efficiency, education, healthcare, citizen participation. How do people have their way to really be connected to the government, make their demands and make their requests, and also be a beneficiary of the smart cities? So we see a lot of these things related to the territory. The second topic is technology. Okay, we say that maybe smart city is known as a technology thing. Technology is a way to address the problem, to solve the problems. And in technology, we see 4 major points for technologies. First of them, and we talk about smart cities context, right? Connectivity, network of connectivity. Could be fiber, could be a wireless network, could be 5G, 4G, Wi-Fi. So things need to be connected. What are the things? Those devices. So the second point, what are the devices that are connected to this network? The sensors, the cameras, connected cars, my cell phone, everyone's cell phone. And this part is very important because in the smart city, we are using these multiple sensors or images to really understand what's going on and take some action. The third pillar in this technology would be like the integrated center or the city cooperation centers where we get all this data, we process the data, we analyze this data, and we take action. And I'm going to open a parenthesis for data. Data is really key today. Data to capture, collect, protect, secure, analyze, and make smart things, artificial intelligence. There is a whole new things and a great opportunity when you talk about technology in this part. And the fourth point will be maybe the applications, the interface with the citizens, with everyone that's really beneficiary of the smart city. And we see citizens are the center of the smart cities. So if we're doing something for the city, we want that to be smart. We cannot forget about the role of the citizens as beneficiary and also proactive participants. We as the government or we as institution can send information to the citizens. However, we also expect the citizens to really be participant in these civic things. And these 4 elements of the city, the smart city, are where you put the technology. And the third pillar of these 3 pillars I mentioned to you, first is territory, the second technology. The third one will be institutions. So what are the things that can accelerate the adoption of smart cities or can prevent it to be it? Our vision, as I said, is Latin America as a region of smart cities. What are the regulations? What are the public things, policies that need to be developed? What are the hinge factors that preventing people to adopt new technology or having the knowledge or the skills sufficient to really transform them, okay? So this is like a little bit about smart cities. So what we're doing at the IDB, so we've been working with Smart City for about 7 to 8 years. We've been working with supporting cities in their migration to become from traditional cities to smart cities. We also developed some literature. So I have a book here that we published. It's available in download, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. We did some case studies. And we also have learned something about what cities value most, what are the issues they are facing, what are maybe the best practices. I will not extend more here, but I'm available during the thing. And we're also developing new cooperation, technical cooperations, where we want to understand the big data. Assume that we're going to get a lot of data from these IoTs, Internet of Things, or sensor cameras. How do we manage this huge amount of data in an efficient way that can allow people to make better decisions? So we have one technical operation we are doing with University Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil to really get together everything related to big data and provide some tools for decision makers to best use of the data. And there's another one that we are developing, a methodology to compare cities in the state of readiness for smart cities. So in our view, we are talking Latin America about a region of nearly 10,000 cities, different sizes and so on. And we see there's a huge opportunity to move this region to a smarter region, to a region of smart cities. Many things need to be done, challenges, but there's huge opportunity. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here today, and also to thank Lisa and Michael. It was a fresh breath air to talk about a different subject, different than NAFTA, or the Argentinian crisis, or political risk in the region. So this is very nice. Also, would like to congratulate members of the panels who have written reports, their respective institutions. I read them last week, and would like to congratulate you on the breadth and the importance that they have. At least in my case, I had been seeing for the last 5 years working on the issue of electric mobility and seeing smart cities only from the perspective of an automaker. But it's certainly the studies open up my mind to subjects such as security and health, etc. So I think it brings a lot of new ideas that are important to see in the region. Having said that, what I would like to share with all of you today is the perspective of the automotive industry on the future of smart cities, and why, as a car company, as a provider of mobility services, we are interested. About 12 years ago, and within BMW, we had an internal research team looking at trends that were moving the automotive industry into the future. Among them, we saw changes in the culture, in people being more interested and worried about the environment. Then we saw the deterioration of the environment, climate change. We also saw the growth of urbanization and the congestions in traffic. We also saw economics, how the price of petrol had been going up in the years. So we had to develop a new strategy based on those trends. And also forgot to mention politics and regulation. Cities where city governments or national governments were putting impediments, regulations on the automotive industry. So we had to think out of the box, see, okay, where do we want to be the next few years? And it matches exactly where the smart cities are going. So essentially what we decided to do was to focus on a strategy where we would be able to maximize in four pillars that we call ACEs. And all of you are having just a single sheet of paper that explains the concept of ACEs, which came out of that in-house study on where the future of mobility was going. So ACEs stands for automated. This is the future of mobility: automated, connectivity, electrified, and shared. So far in Latin America, we have focused in the electrification side. Nevertheless, and I will explain to you before going there, you can read by yourself, but essentially what it means is automation is the future. Most likely by 2022, most key automakers will have some type of advanced autonomous mobility, especially in the main megalopolis of the world. Second, that will reduce morbidity rates. It will improve the efficiency of the grids of the city. You were saying shaving off time that we spend in gridlock, and also it will save. Also, it will be more fuel efficient. Then the connectivity is all of the apps that we have is to make sure that the vehicle becomes an integral part of your everyday life, and that it provides value and it provides a better quality of life. Electrification is essential for any smart city because with electrification you have a reduction in pollution, reduction in emissions. And that is what we have been focusing in Latin America as one of the 4 pillars. And then we have the shared part. The shared part is very important because it will reduce the number of cars in the streets. You may say, wow, somebody from the automotive industry that wants less cars in the streets. Yes, we want less cars in the streets. We have a pilot program in Berlin going on at this time. We're in several neighborhoods. We have approached the neighbors so they can do groups where share vehicles and get vehicles off the streets. We had a member of our board a year ago in New York at a conference saying, okay, New York City has about 2 million vehicles. In the future, we would like to see 90% of those vehicles out of the street and just have 200,000 cars. Why? How are we going to survive? Well, having shared vehicles, there's actually the stream of revenue from charging per mile travel is higher than the stream of revenue from selling vehicles. So companies like ours and others, we are no longer what they call in the industry steel benders. We're just not shaping steel, putting the cars and churning them out of the factory. We're becoming something else. We're becoming members of part of the providers of mobility. And how does this relate to smart cities? I think it relates directly in all the 4 pillars, because as you were saying, it's connectivity, it's sharing services, it's having the citizens, the people who live in Bogota or Santiago to have a better quality of life, to have a higher life expectancy. So having said that, in Latin America, how does it apply to our case? Having traveled through the region, I think the awareness is there. There is something that was very interesting from the study. And awareness is key, and education is key. People to be aware that they are able to utilize these apps and applying in different aspects of their life is very important. And also having ecosystems. You do not give it that name specifically in the report, but we experience it in the electrification of different markets when we introduce vehicles. We have to work hand in hand with civil society, hand in hand with government, central government, with municipalities, with electric providers. And we become an ecosystem so we can provide this new service that can improve the quality of air in the city. The same thing is with shared mobility. Same thing is with connectivity. Therefore, one of the ideas that occurred to me after having this invitation and I've been in contact with colleagues in our headquarters is to see how we can organize a road trip in the major capitals of the city, bring experts from different parts of the world and share the experiences of other key cities with BMW. For example, in Copenhagen, we have a fleet of 400 vehicles that are being shared. Also, we have very interesting pilot projects in Melbourne and also in China, which is one of the biggest markets where we are piloting and as a driving force of what we want to replicate. And last but not least, I already mentioned that for us in Latin America, the charging networks was the clear experience of how we can accelerate the adoption of these technologies to improve the lives in the cities by working in conjunction with governments, essentially private-public partnerships. So I'll be more than glad to answer more questions, but that has been our experience and how we see it from the automotive industry. Thank you.
So, like you heard, I'm from AT&T, and we provide a lot of the telecom network and infrastructure that smart cities technologies run on. I thought during my comments today I would talk a little bit about sort of the connectivity we provide, then how a company sees the ecosystem of smart city technologies or Internet of Things technologies, as we refer to them, and then talk a little bit about the public policy questions that surround this basket of technology and how governments can motivate adoption and deployment of the technologies that run this and allow cities to be made smarter. Thank you. I should have started. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for your attendance and attention today. I thought the McKinsey report was great in that it crystallized a lot of very diverse information and drew important conclusions sort of across the wide variety of technologies that fall into the smart cities basket. In particular, like you've heard from a couple of speakers already today, it's important to see smart cities not as an end unto themselves, but as a way to make the lives of the people that live in cities better. You can make people's lives healthier, you can give them more free time, they can be safer, energy can be used in a more sustainable, energy and resources can be used in a more sustainable way, and all of those things can be facilitated through smart cities technology. We provide the connectivity that drives a lot of that. It takes a lot of different forms. A long, long time ago, like 5 or 10 years ago, there was something called 3G technology, which some smart cities technologies still run on. We're now in the age of 4G or LTE, it's called, and we're now moving toward 5G, fifth generation wireless technology, which is going to enable greater throughput, faster communication, longer battery life, lower energy usage, and it's going to be characterized by much denser networks that are able to support millions and millions of more connected devices than we have today. So all of that is going to facilitate smart city technology and other IoT technologies because the more things get connected, the more wireless transmission capacity you use, or we all use, and 5G technology will support that. We at AT&T look at smart cities technologies in sort of 5 different categories. And those actually are in addition to things like connected health and a couple of the other categories that the McKinsey report kind of talks about in connection with this set of issues as well. So we focus first on energy and utility technologies, smart grid, smart metering, any way that you can put intelligence and connectivity into utility networks, whether they're electricity or water or gas pipelines. You can always improve the performance of these networks by embedding sensors and communications capability in them so you can see where assets are about to break down, where your choke points in capacity are. It's possible to read people's electrical meters. Well, initially, people drove the truck down the street and read them with Wi-Fi signals. Now, electrical meters and water meters can be read by someone just sitting in a central office and hitting a button, and all the meters tweet out their information, and presto, you get your utility bill. So that is the first basket. The second we call civic engagement. You've heard already today about the possibilities for participation in government, receipt of government services, providing feedback to government. All of those things can make a significant and dramatic improvement in the lives of the people that the government is designed to serve. And I live here in Washington, and I've been here for quite a while and remember many years ago when Washington was the least responsive and most opaque city government that you can imagine. And it may not be the best one in the country or the world yet, but it has made massive improvements, and consequently life as a resident of DC has become stupendously easier through being able to do things online and with e-government solutions. So I'm a personal witness to the difference that this can make in someone's life. We've also heard about public safety. There's a variety of smart city technologies that we support that contribute to safety, everything from allowing cities to monitor public space, to ensure proper lighting in public space areas. There's also this great technology called ShotSpotter that we provide communications for that involves gunshot sensors that are placed all over cities, and when a gun goes off, the sound takes different times to travel to the different sensors. You can determine by triangulation exactly where the gunshot took place. Using the sound signature associated with the gun, you can tell how many guns were fired, how many shots were fired, what kind of gun it is. So you suddenly have this wealth of information that law enforcement personnel show up with at the scene of a potential crime, and they're better able to keep people safe, they're better able to respond to the needs on the ground, and they're better able to protect themselves. So public safety is basket number 3. Basket number 4, you've already heard a fair amount about transportation. Everything from connected cars to making public transportation smarter, preventing breakdowns, or foreseeing breakdowns before they happen. There are these great technologies that put connectivity into parking meters. So first you can pay parking with your cell phone, and even more satisfying, you can see where open parking spaces are, so you don't have to cruise around the block all the time, and that reduces congestion and reduces energy consumption and makes it easier to shop or do business in particular parts of town. And last, there's infrastructure, everything from monitoring the structural integrity of bridges, checking to see what the condition of roads is. Are there potholes? Are they freezing too quickly? Do they need maintenance or de-icing? One of my favorite examples of this infrastructure technology involves a big deployment that we did in Las Vegas, Nevada. It is a very dry place. It's in the middle of the desert. They have this massive water system that is pretty old and reaching the end of its useful life, and there's a water main that serves most of the city that runs right down a very busy street in the middle of Las Vegas. And the utility that owns the water main was becoming concerned that it was going to need to be replaced in the future and, cause all sorts of disruption because they were going to dig up the streets and they were going to spend all this money replacing the water main, and it was just going to be a big, expensive mess. And one of the companies that we work with developed this sounding technology where they put sensors along the inside of this water main and can actually tell from the echoes that little leaks create where there are leaks. And little leaks, apparently in the water main world, become big leaks and lead to catastrophic events. So this allows, it's just sort of a single example of how you can monitor infrastructure, repair it before it becomes a catastrophic failure, and consequently significantly extend the useful life of major capital assets in a city. So that's kind of at a high level some of the products that we support. I'd like to talk just briefly, well, I guess first I should back up and say AT&T has telecom networks that support smart cities technology mostly in the United States and in Mexico. We provide roaming and support cell phone service and some other connectivity throughout the rest of Latin America, but we don't own and operate telecom networks across most of Latin America. Nevertheless, in the US and Mexico, we have had a lot of the public policy conversations with governments that are interested in motivating deployment of these technologies, and the issues translate into the rest of Latin America. So I thought I'd share some of the things that we talk about with policymakers that are interested in speeding deployment of these technologies. So there are, first, privacy and security. Whenever you have particularly governments holding a lot of data about their citizens, especially if it's online and potentially reachable by bad people, you need to ensure robust privacy and cybersecurity protections. And our pitch routinely is that governments should work with private industry and civil society and other stakeholders and try to achieve a sort of meaningful set of privacy protections and security protections without adopting kind of a checklist approach. You have to do X, Y, and Z to meet the cybersecurity protections in a particular jurisdiction, because cybersecurity is a constantly evolving threat, and it's better served to have all of the players that focus on this on a daily basis doing their best thinking and their best work to protect the security and the privacy of data. Better to do that than to have some sort of top-down dictate from governments about the 5 things that companies need to do to protect cybersecurity. Similarly, with privacy, some of the data that is involved in smart city technology is pretty sensitive data. It potentially involves locations of consumers and how they use their energy and where they go on a daily basis. And all of that potentially is being held by governments, which have their own, at times, uneasy relationship with their citizenry. So we've found that an important important step in protecting privacy of that information is to gather all of the stakeholders around the table. So the technology providers, the application providers, the citizens, NGOs, civil society, as well as law enforcement and some of the other entities that may want to use this data, and have an open conversation about how the data can be used, because some of the data is relatively less sensitive and can do with potentially less privacy protection. Some of it is much more sensitive and should be protected at a higher level. But it's important through these long, difficult conversations to work out the right level of privacy for the particular type of data that you have. Next, I would make a plug for trying to regulate smart city technologies and the telecom technologies that support them less rather than more. So to the extent that governments are able to rely on private sector best practices or multi-stakeholder technologies, that is in many cases going to be a more kind of robust and nimble way of addressing the problems that governments might otherwise choose to aim at first with regulation. It's our routine exhortation is that these technologies are not like wireline telephony, and they shouldn't be immediately put into the category of legacy telecom services and regulated that way. This is a different type of technology that is used for a much broader set of needs and needs to have a different regulatory paradigm associated with it. To the extent that regulation is necessary, it's important to unify that across a whole government. So you don't want, we have technologies that potentially fall, to take the US example, within, am I running out of time? Okay, quickly wrapping up. That fall within the ambit or the jurisdiction of a variety of different federal government agencies. And what we try to persuade the US federal government to do is have those agencies talk to each other. Don't have the FDA and the Federal Communications Commission and the Food and Drug, Federal Aviation Administration and all these other agencies regulating their own little piece of the smart city pie. do it consistently and across the board, so both the businesses involved and the consumers that are benefiting from these technologies know what kind of protections there are and how to go about invoking them. And I'll stop. I could go on, but.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to ask just a brief follow-up question to each of the speakers, and then we can open up to the audience. So I'll go in the same order. Jana, you mentioned that in some of the Latin American cities, one of the technologies that you do see is ride-hailing. And I think that this is really almost completely driven by the private sector. I mean, basically Uber, decided to go into these cities, and there've definitely been some challenges, but it was really because of the company's initiative. So just as an example, in terms of the broader question, to what extent does this really depend on technology types of companies deciding to go into markets which may be a bit trickier than the US or European markets that they're used to? And to what extent would you say this is driven by the government?
I think that's a great question. And the answer is it really does depend on the application and on the structure in that area. So healthcare, for example, in the US is largely a private sector affair. In Europe and in many parts of Latin America, it is largely, a large share of that is public sector. So it really does depend. And I think one of the exciting things of this space is that there is so much change happening and so much innovation happening that I don't think we even should have very strong priors of who it should come from. I think we should think about what are the different ways we could solve this problem, what might be the different roles for government and the private sector. And ideally, I think we'll need to find more ways to do that we have in the past. And actually, one of the reasons why I am so excited about this space for Latin America is that this is a region where cities already have shown that they are able to innovate in a collaborative way between the government, the local government, and the cities. We all have heard about Medellin, that for decades, where the private sector has been a major driver, a lot of the social initiatives across the city. In Monterrey, Mexico, the private sector has been a big leader on education, etc. And it is those cities where you see the government and the businesses work together to try to solve some of the problems that are clear problems for everyone. That's the way to move forward. So in the case of shared rides, it actually is it clearly was an easy solution for private sector to come in. I think it's a more challenge for the regulator because of the fact that they come to an industry that's already very regulated, which is the taxi industry. And how do you adjust? In many ways, the city is responding to a situation they are already facing. I think we'll see just some of that experimentation continuing, and I think this is a region that I hope will be a leader, as it has in many other areas. I mean, there's innovations that this region has brought to the rest of the world, such as the rapid transit buses, for example, etc. And I think I would like to see more of that in the smart cities. And I think there is actually a lot of social sector innovation as well. I mean, Mexico City has a very dynamic startup culture of developing apps for solving very specific solutions, even building apps that actually do track the local minivans by crowdsourcing, etc. It is a fun space. And I don't think we have an answer ex ante. I think it's going to look different than we anticipate.
Thank you. Mauricio, you talked a little bit about the security, and I was wondering if you could tell us in a little bit more detail about how smart cities are using applications for security, especially the examples that you've seen in Rio, more specifically. Okay.
Can you hear me? So I think this is a very maybe broad and very specific and very complex problem. This is the major issue that we see in the mayors in Latin America and Caribbean. I'll say from one perspective, we are looking for things in maybe the short term, monitoring, evidence, and so on. And the second thing is we're looking things how we change the current status of the cities in terms of criminality, etc. That's something much more complex, where you look for people who are excluded. They see a benefit for being in the crime, opportunities, and also people who are persecuted, just a small portion, 6% of people who are in jail, for example, who are commit a crime are persecuted and things. So there's maybe two complex things, and I won't get too much in detail on the long term or the midterm that you are developing better better cities for better people, for including people, for generating job, inclusion, and so on. But let's look in the short term, where mayors and people are very concerned about criminality. So you have a lot of maybe resources to monitor the criminality. For example, you have cameras that you can see the environment, the territory, and see what's going on, and you can react that. You can react that, send the police for the right time to maybe avoid this kind of crime, and you can also have the evidence for later on to prosecute people, things. But if you look more specific in the camera, you can see that today you can see cities that have like a center with a lot of images or displays that are just feeding the image from the cameras, and you see people just looking maybe 10 different cameras simultaneously, right? So that's maybe, let's say that's the smart city for security version 1, where you're just looking for images. And then you can go deeper and have smart cameras, smart image interpretation, and so on, where you don't need maybe people looking at that. And you also mentioned about gun control, or maybe gun detection, right? Or maybe sound sensors, where you have much more capacity to look at that. So that's one thing that you could look at criminality, maybe in this kind of things of monitoring. You have the criminality or security or public safety, where you're looking about the data that you can collect, the data, have GPS and so on and so on. Until you have like the things related, maybe panic button, where someone who is being threatened can press some button, something could be also connect all the cameras or maybe all the police and dispatching in a very way to get to the right point. So in that sense, the smart city, you have some technical resources that will allow you to be much more responsive, predict, looking at the data from the observatory, and at the same time looking for developing a public policy for the mid and long term.
I see, interesting. Guillermo, I wanted to ask you more about the question, bring it back to the issue of electric vehicles, and thank you for bringing this up, and especially since the report was made possible also with support from BMW. And my question is about how you see the connection between shared kind of new technologies in the transportation space and new, not just technologies, but also trends, and how it impacts the actual use of electric vehicles. So a lot of the projections I've seen show that whether or not we see a mass introduction of electric vehicles really depends a lot on what happens with car sharing services, because when you have a fleet of cars that are driving all day, it's a no-brainer to make them all electric because it's easier to make charging points and the fuel savings are huge. So whereas from the perspective of BMW, what do you think are the prospects of that kind of transformation happening in Latin America? You know, we're starting to see a little bit of transformation in a few places like Norway, but what about in Latin America where it's still very early days?
To give you an excellent example, last year I was in Medellin at a conference on innovation. And during the conference, which was 2 days, I was approached by several entrepreneurs from Medellin who were setting up their own companies to do shared mobility services with conventional vehicles, some hybrids, some are incorporating some electric vehicles, Nissans, BMWs, etc. The interesting thing that I noticed was that there was momentum. No one had gone to Medellin and told these entrepreneurs that there was a momentum and self-reliability to start something. And the development doesn't have to be in parallel. We don't need all electric vehicles all at once so we can have shared services. Ideally, let's say in a city as congested and polluted as Mexico City, it would be ideal to have fleets of electric vehicles that are shared so we have less congestion, we have less pollution. That's the ideal world. But they will develop not in sync, but at different stages. And that's good. It doesn't matter. We might have shared driving in one city, much less developed, but we have more electric mobility and vice versa. But it doesn't matter. The important thing is that we start seeing a trend in all four pillars, the connectivity, the sharing, electric, and eventually the autonomous driving. I don't know if my colleagues agree on that, but that's the way at least how we see it. It doesn't matter. La suma de los factores no altera el producto. How you sum it up, it doesn't change the result.
Could I add on that?
Yes.
not only in connected cars or autonomous vehicles, but in a lot of other smart technologies, it seems to us that there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. You know, you have, what you want to do is have this robust market where whatever the application is in high demand, and that will cause this rush of providers in to provide the services and the technology. But you don't have citizens seeing the benefit of it because it's not out there, so the demand doesn't exist. And one of the points that we make to government is that, you know, they are, in many cases, depending on the city or municipality, ideally suited to seed that demand. So you can have governments that adopt, you know, smart building technology or fleet management technologies or mobility technologies. And they can hopefully see savings from it, and they can also kind of introduce it to the people that live in their area and motivate some demand that way, which in turn will cause other service providers to come in and satisfy the demand. So another thing that I couldn't get to earlier is government in many ways is able to kind of prime the pump or stimulate demand for a lot of these different technologies and get beyond the initial impediment to adoption.
Right, that's a very interesting point. Whether it's government buildings, using technologies, government fleets, yeah, you have a scale there that.
Right. I mean, fleet management is important with, you know, trash trucks and police cars, building technologies. You've got a variety of different municipal employees that have to drive around for one reason or another. They would be ideal consumers of mobility services. So there's a lot of this could serve government as kind of an anchor tenant and then move out from there.
Well, I think I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask questions. So we have microphones. I think they're coming. Just please wait for the microphone and introduce yourself before asking your question. We have one over here.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent are you able to get the people together with online meetings to get consensus and get private sector funding into things?
Let's take a couple of questions before answering. Over here.
Good afternoon to everyone. It was a pleasure to be part of this presentation, and I really applaud all the participants for the insights. One of the things that thinking about Latin America, I'm from the IDB, Dino Caprirolo, once again, and I'm an economist. And one of the things that we see is like the government is always late in promoting human capital. So what we see that Latin America will be adopters of technology once again. Okay, and Latin American countries really motivate and stimulate startups to create these new applications for solving Latin American problems. What we have seen in the past is like government is very heavy, and they have the procurement process that are not really allowing creation and innovation. And I don't know if some colleagues can help us in trying to figure it out, what you can suggest about it. Thanks.
Let's take one more over here and then over here, so you don't have to run.
Thank you very much. Alexander Kravitz from Insight. Great presentations. I have two questions, one on privacy and one on the ecosystems. I'm glad the point of privacy was brought up, but perhaps I'll put my question to Ms. Jana. The model that seemed to be presented was more of a self-regulation one, it seemed to me. And we've seen how self-regulation, you know, the Facebooks and the Googles have worked out. I would argue not very well in terms of individual privacy. So I'm wondering if you could give us kind of the McKinsey view on what are the potential dangers to individual privacy in this, you know, new era that we're moving to. And then on ecosystems, to Guillermo, it seems that you're going. You know, government participation, government being a key actor for establishing the conditions of these for these ecosystems to actually function is a sine qua non, and it makes me think that there's some cities in Latin America that simply are not going to be able to to move. I mean, the example of Washington was being put here about how things have advanced. There's some cities in Latin America that, never mind bike lanes, they don't even really have appropriate, sidewalks to walk. So making that leapfrogging might not happen. I'll leave it at that. I had a couple more, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more question. The man in the front row over here.
I'm Timothy Towell, 30 years in the State Department, virtually all of it in Latin America. The question about the private sector versus the public sector is what I'm interested in, having been a former political officer. How do you make sure that a government will do all this wonderful stuff that these experts have discussed and has been studying and talking about forever and ever, amen, when you have democratic governments rather than authoritarian governments? All my governments were authoritarian. If they decide to do what you want them to do, or you want them to do it, they'd click their heels and order it, and it would be done. Can you go downtown in this wonderful democracy and hand your papers to Donald Trump, and will he do any of that stuff? I lived here during the Second World War, and there were wonderful transportation. They were called trolley cars. Why did the trolley cars that went all over town very fast, why did they go away? I can tell you, the private sector, wonderful American companies like Firestone Tire and Rubber Company and General Motors Diesel that lobbied the private sector, democracy, and unloaded the trolley cars that worked and brought us these awful smelly buses that can't go anywhere because of traffic overload. How do you deal with that problem?
Okay, we can just, you can each give a short response, and you don't have to respond to all of the questions, just whichever ones were most relevant. Why don't we start?
Okay. I'd touch briefly on your privacy point. I think I mentioned self-regulation, but I also mentioned multi-stakeholder efforts. And I think those are very different from the self-regulation which you point to as having failed with Facebook, because we have been involved in a number of different multi-stakeholder efforts that related to different aspects of the Internet of Things. And those are not, paper tigers. They often involve government as a stakeholder. They involve very robust civil society participation. So it is not a top-down regulatory effort with, the threat of jail behind it. But I think to dismiss those efforts that I think are kind of robust and meaningful and results in significant protection is not entirely fair. And I think that, those are the kind of things that we advocate routinely, because I've worked at the FCC for a number of years before I came to AT&T, and I know the speed of regulation, and the speed of regulation almost never keeps up with the speed of technology. And these multi-stakeholder efforts can be difficult and cumbersome, but even they move faster than regulation in many cases. And they are often more successful at aiming at the particular problem and creating the appropriate protections against it than regulation, which can be overtaken by leaps in technology. And it's not perfect, I will admit, but it's also more than just a company saying, oh, I'm going to behave myself. And to circle back briefly to my comments about privacy, a lot of the privacy issues related to smart cities don't even squarely or primarily involve the private sector. They primarily involve the holder of the data, which in many cases is city or state governments. And those entities need to decide, when the taxing authorities can look at that data, when the enforcement authorities can look at that data. how it can be cabined off and protected while still being opened up to meaningful use by citizens that want to mine the data for additional applications that could further improve a city's operating. So it's a complicated and ongoing conversation that I think there's a good argument to be made can be accomplished more effectively outside of, I said so type regulation by governments. And to the point about virtual meetings, I suspect that would work fine. In my experience, they're generally face-to-face meetings because then you have everyone in the room talking and not multitasking at their desk or putting the phone on mute while they walk the dog or something.
Yes, in my case, I will quickly address the question about how to get governments to do what you want them to do or what they should do. You can't. You can't do it. It's in their interest to do it or not to do it. Because if they don't, they will be less competitive and they will have other countries be ahead of them. So essentially what we do, we go in, we present best practices, best technologies, and then it's up to the governments, either local or central, whether or not they decide to adopt them or not. To give 3 examples, we introduced electromobility in Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. One of the first things is, okay, there has to be only one type of charger. So the government must legislate and say, okay, there will be one type of charger. We cannot have 10 types of chargers because it will be a mess. Okay, so that's something positive that the government, okay, they legislate, say, okay, this will be the only type of charger allowed, and that allows for massification of the technology, etc. So at the end, if a country decides not to play by the rules and not to have a competitive level field for the business, then a business will not go there. So it's Adam Smith all over again. Yes.
Yeah, just to add something that Guillermo mentioned in terms of the role of the government compared to private sector. I think the private sector will go where the most profit will come out. And the government has maybe the role to bring social development and bring the things, filling the gaps. And in terms of smart cities, for example, the way we are working with the government is making sure that they understand what smart city, what are the benefits, what are the economic and social benefits from the cities, so they can see the opportunity for really developing their countries. For sure, we have a lot of factors that are inhibiting the progress of smart cities, or maybe not the progress of smart cities, but addressing the major problems that are facing by the cities, right? And we're looking about, okay, where is the leadership, right? So does the government have the leadership, the knowledge, or maybe the thought leadership to advocate in pro of their other cities or other governments, say, hey, this is the way we're going to do. So I think we're still lacking some level of knowledge, information to advocate, that I mean that the countries in general, to advocate in pro of using technology to leverage their own cities, their own countries, etc., in pro of addressing the biggest problems. We're still lacking some problems related to skills. So we're talking about this digital transformation, smart cities, and so on. How many people do know related, what's an IoT, what kind of sensor, how do they work, how they can use that, what kind of data I collect from these different sensors, how do I manage that? In US, for example, there's a lackage of 190,000 people with this kind of skills of social science, right? Social science for data. So there's a lot of lack of knowledge here in the United States, for example. Or about in Latin America and other countries. For sure, we have good universities. We had a lot of good people, very skilled people, but still lacking that to take the benefit of that. So we are also working with government in terms of skills, leadership. What about privacy? We talked about that. At the time we're starting to get this data, we are looking about privacy. We're talking about the cyber vulnerability. For example, in Latin America, Caribbean, 4 out of each 5 countries, they don't have the strategy to protect their critical infrastructure related to cyber security. They don't have, like 2/3 of them, for example, don't have a center to monitor what's going on in the cities or in the countries. And we talk about critical infrastructure. It could be a metro, could be the connected cars in the future, could be maybe other things, traffic lights, for example, where you can change once they are connected. And we see also like a vast majority of the of the countries, they don't have people who are with the enough maybe skills or legal skills to persecute someone who has violated or had invaded the thing. So we are working with the government with something in these areas to make sure that they can understand the benefits of migrating for smart cities. And then we see the private sector as a very key participant in this transformation, because the government will have limited reach, mostly the public policy, etc. But the private sector is the one who can bring maybe pilots, they can bring funding, they can bring research, they can bring a lot of areas that complement the part of the government, right? So we're talking with people from Baltimore, for example, and they were just mentioning that some areas of the city are very well connected. They have broadband connectivity, but you cross the street, they have very little connectivity. And that's why I say the city needs to invest in this area, because private sector doesn't feel that's attractive enough to bring broadband connectivity. And the result is that people will be excluded. So those are just some kind of things related to the role of private sector, government, and so on.
So I think clearly the private-public barrier is a big question in this space. And I think it is interesting when you look back over the last 10 years, we have seen a pretty significant change. 10 years ago, most smart city discussions were led by the private sector. It was really the private sector leaders who thought, cities, that's our next target audience. We are going to go after and sell them this and this and this. And often these were ideas that were thought in the back room in the companies, and we all know it. And we just wanted to send the salespeople to sell them to the cities. Cities were obviously happy to hear about good solutions. They were promised the sun and the moon. In almost every case, the promises were not met. So I think there was a clear kind of a hype and a bust in the smart city solutions early on, largely driven by private sector players. And I think the bust came at the bottom of that was 2013, when The Economist ran an online debate called "Are Smart Cities Just Empty Hype?" The good news is that we are now 5 years further, and I think both cities and the companies are a lot smarter. And I think that's a reason for being more hopeful, because the cities have realized that they really don't want to see salespeople selling products that clearly have been thought through by the companies but don't necessarily answer their questions. I think if you want to read a very thoughtful city perspective and understand how cities are thinking about, Boston put out an excellent and very concise, they call it the Boston Smart City Manifesto, where they have 5 things they tell you, and I can't remember them all, but the first one is, don't sell us salespeople. Solve real problems for real Bostonians. And the underlying question is, who of the Bostonians have you talked to, and what problem are you solving for us? And then one of them is actually and the third one I think is, platforms make us go, which means don't come and tell us I want to be the platform provider. So I think it just gives you a sense of the frustrations from the city's side, which on the other hand, I think the companies have also realized. The truth is, companies are not making a lot of money on smart city solutions. Cities are extremely hard customers to serve. They are small, fragmented. The leadership changes all the time. They are fragmented even within a city. They are not easy customers for companies. And I won't say no, but very few people are making money out of smart city solutions. So this is kind of the chicken and an egg problem that my co-panelists were already referring to. But I think that means that the companies are much more taking a customer-friendly, they need to understand what the city's problems are and bring together the whole group and be part of the ecosystem. So the companies that have been successful have been doing exactly that. So that makes me a little bit more hopeful. However, it is not just the companies and the cities, then there's the citizens. As someone who lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, NIMBYism, where you can build and what you can do, I mean, cities are complicated things. They are the most fascinating, but also the very complicated environment. So I don't think there's easy solutions. And I think the progress is going to be slower because of many of these challenges. But I think people are aware of them now, and I think are more realistic in their expectations. So on the question of privacy then, I cannot talk for McKinsey. We don't have one view, but I can talk for myself. And I think it is clearly one of the critical challenges, but I think its perceptions are quite different. I grew up in Finland, where frankly, we all have a social security identification number. A lot of my information is readily available to the bank teller who I go and open a bank account. We have just a country where we have a lot less concerns about sharing privacy. My medical records are as part of a pool of a genetically more similar pool that's used by many, many medical researchers for gene research. Finland is a big hub for that because we have long-time historical data, etc. So I grew up in an environment where data concerns were not as large because we trusted the government. In California, that's not necessarily the case for some of the examples that you mentioned. So I think, for me personally, there are two critical things to get right. First of all, we need to get some kinds of rules about data. And I think GDPR, Europe is taking a clear leadership. I would love to hear what my co-panelists think, but I think most companies, mine included, were happy that there is some kind of rule and use them for their global operations, as we do. We basically thought, okay, at least now we have some kind of guidelines that we can align on rather than everybody trying to do their own things. So, big challenge, we need to have some rules and guidelines so we can start operating under some kind of agreement of what that means. But I think then when you go into the nuts and bolts, I think what everyone needs to start doing is to really be able to separate the sensitive data from everything else. We basically need to be extremely focused on carrying the data that really matters. I am personally quite worried, particularly about data that can be used to discriminate, that because of the fact that most of our data sets are not representative, a lot of the challenges for data analytics is the fact that we have certain samples that are providing more data and others where actually you might cause discrimination in a way that you don't anticipate because you had the data run the way it did. I think we need to be very careful on what data we guard and how do we use it. But then there's other data that we don't frankly need to worry about. So there's a lot of data that is relatively low risk, some public data, completely anonymous data that I think we should make as available as we can so the private sector can innovate there. So I think we just need to get much more practical and tangible on, we won't solve any of these privacy issues on the abstract. I think it will be some clear guidelines, GDPR. I personally think it's progress, and just continue doing better at targeting the important data and making as much of the data available as we can so that we don't stop the innovation. Last, very quickly on the connectivity. One of the quality of life dimensions that we assessed but I didn't talk about was connectivity between citizens and the city and between citizens amongst themselves. And it was interesting to see that having a good social media strategy for a city increases significantly, something like 15%, the connectivity that these people felt with their city. So in a way, being thoughtful on what you have on your social media, people actually feel more connected to the city, feel better about the city than in a city where that's happening largely through more intermediated ways. Even more importantly, there are some of these local apps. I don't know if any of you know or used Nextdoor in your neighborhood. These are basically neighborhood by neighborhood apps where you can talk about the neighborhood issues. In mine, for example, the majority of my little neighborhood belong to this, and the discussions are mostly about why did the power go off and whose dog is lost and have you seen this? I mean, whose cat is this that has been lost? And it actually is something that for generation, particularly the younger generation that's used to connecting via the apps, it is a way for you to really feel that you are aware of your community better, you know your neighbors, even when you might not need to run into them. So I think there are many, it doesn't necessarily solve the private sector. This is a complete private solution, but there are ways for using some of these smart city solutions to make us create these imagined communities within the urban centers.
Thanks. I'm going to take a couple more questions. Looking for the microphone. Let's start over here. All the way at the back, the blue shirt to the right.
Thank you. Is it on? There we go. Thank you. I suppose my question's an extension of this last topic, but I wanted to narrow it a little bit specifically to open data and open source code and federated data platforms. I should say I'm Andrew with Resilience.io, a UK NGO. Actually, it's also nice to hear about Medellin. We're working with Ruta Ene in Medellin through CoData, the International Science Council, on a data integration initiative on resilient cities. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on there, especially with their open data strategy and soon to be launched open data portal with the municipality. And so my question's related to this. But since we have so many, so this isn't meant to be critical. But given that the panel is predominantly from the private sector, Marcelo, wondering if Mauricio, excuse me. So from IDB's perspective of how you navigate the question of working with municipal officials in their decision making to promote open source code, federated data platforms, open data in general. And I should wrap it up, but just to say though that given that many private sector, from our experience and perspective, given that many of the private sector vendors, if you will, aren't making that much money in the smart cities domain, that actually is putting more pressure on in initial conversations in the procurement to own the civic data, often for decades, to solve a specific problem, whether that's water pipe sensors or urban mobility. And so then it takes actually savvy and to work with the public sector to show and demonstrate the value, obviously with security consideration, but otherwise the value of open source data and open access, and how this can actually generate the incredible innovative capacity of whether it's through citizen science or grassroots efforts to provide lots of urban solutions. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, let's take another one over here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Really appreciate the panel. It's been really exciting to be in a room with everybody who's got a common and shared interest. My name is Aaron Kirsch. I'm with CNS Global Advisors, and we work to arrange capital from foreign investors to fund a lot of the projects that you're talking about on the smart city, let's say, spectrum. One of the areas that we identified as most interesting and most impactful was the area of public lighting infrastructure. I see the topic of security, safety, transportation, all of these things, are mentioned, and also point out the fact that a country like Colombia takes 3% of their total electricity consumption, and that is allocated to just lighting the streets. So our perspective is simply that public lighting is one of the lowest hanging fruits of investment opportunities that generate the highest amount of impact. And so my two questions for the panel are, one, would you agree with that? Does that make sense? And two, maybe you can share some ideas on some other low-hanging fruits that investors from the international community might be able to turn their attention to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In the front here.
Good afternoon. Omawale Crenshaw, Howard University. Two questions. One, it's around educational institutions. How can educational institutions be better partners in the smart cities conversation? Personally, Howard University is currently working with the city of Cali, Colombia, and they're helping develop their master plan, specifically focusing on communities of Afro and indigenous descent. And so we're working in partnership with the city as well as UN Habitat. So we're super excited about that, but would love to get some additional ideas as we help this planning process and how we incorporate smart cities concepts, et cetera. Second question, you mentioned a lot as the cities are urbanizing, a lot of these communities, these migrants are coming predominantly from rural areas. What's the challenges and what's the strategies around incorporating these groups of folks who historically have been disconnected, and now they're trying to get connected as they're migrating to these cities, particularly in the last 15, 20 years. And, people keep talking about Colombia in the last, 10 years, because of narcotraficantes and all of this stuff, as well as now as the influx of Venezuelans coming in. So it's creating some huge issues, and would love to also look at some smart city strategies on how we can get those folks integrated and participatory.
Let me take one on this side.
Can I ask a question?
Okay, go ahead.
In the back there.
My question is for Guillermo and Jana. I wanted to know from you guys' perspective, what's the best platform you've seen or organization you've seen that has handled civic engagement? In what city or what country have you seen the best case scenario for that, for civic engagement?
Hi. Hi, my name is Alejandro. I'm part of the startup community in infrastructure, and I was born and raised in Honduras. I think that the success of technology lies on the strength of the underlying relationships. You know, and in case of smart cities, it's human relationships. That's why it's so complicated. In a region where there's not trust in institutions, in justice systems, how are you introducing these things into the strategy of implementing technologies and in order to make it a success? Because otherwise it just won't happen.
Okay. All right, we'll take one more.
Thank you. Two questions. What role will microgrids play in the future of smart cities and blockchain?
Let me summarize. Let me just go over the. There was a question about open data, about public lighting, about educational initiatives, about migration, civic engagement, institutions and justice systems, microgrids, and blockchain. And please keep your answers brief. Just maybe focus on, 2 or 3 of the questions, so we have enough time for everyone to respond. Go ahead.
So I'd like to address the university and education question. I think, well, first, AT&T a couple years ago hosted a hackathon, I think, at Howard. And that sort of points up one important touch point for the education community, which is, you've got a lot of young, engaged, smart, energetic, connected people who are a perfect laboratory for innovation. So to the extent that universities can find a way to harness that enthusiasm and knowledge for new applications or new ways of doing things, so much the better. And that, I think, is true of any university, not just ones here in the US. I mean, it's easy and quick to set up a hackathon at a university, and for a relatively little bit of prize money and some public recognition, you can get all sorts of great product coming out of it. And the other thing that your question brought to mind for me, well, 2 other things actually. First, because of their campus nature, universities and colleges are often a great sort of test bed for some smart city technologies. So, universities can sit down, examine their own operations, figure out what a problem is, and start casting about for applications or technologies, either homegrown or out there on the market already, that can help address whatever the issue may be. And lastly, on your question about migration, this is not a panacea, but one of the things that a lot of cities are doing is providing free public Wi-Fi as part of their smart city installations. So, for instance, in New York, there are all these, long abandoned public telephone boxes that have copper wiring running to them, and those have been turned into these sort of smart city kiosks that have information and advertising and internet access and free Wi-Fi in them. So to the extent that cities are otherwise deploying, a suite of smart city technologies, it is often not too difficult to add on the notion of free public connectivity. And that is, apart from the university question, something that could benefit migrant and low-income city residents.
Yes, I'm going to address 2 questions that are within my realm of knowledge. Regarding ways that universities can be part of this process, I think the first step is reaching out to other actors and sitting down in an initial meeting and see where we have points of convergence and where we can work together. As an example, in Chile, we're working with Universidad Católica of Chile. In Mexico, we're going working with Tecnológico de Monterrey, and also with the Ibero University, the Jesuit University. And this points of context were some of them initiated by us, some by them, and it began by sitting on a first meeting and see what were our mutual goals, where we coincided in the same goals, and then draw up a plan of action. Same thing with United Nations. It's essentially, there's no better or worse way to do it. And then with regards to the best platform for civic engagement, there's really no best platform as long as there is one. And then going even one step beyond, countries where you have democratic representative democracies is where you have the best platforms. To give you some examples, Chile, Mexico, Colombia is where you have the most success because those are open, free societies.
Okay, I want to just add something regarding the civic engagement. We agree that there's a lot of data being shared for the cities, and there's a mass, different kind of organization within the cities or governments. They have different data that are not interoperable. So one thing that we are working here to make sure that everything could be smooth is just trying to understand all this data, where they are, different kind of data. We're talking about big data, different structure, different kind of types, videos, images, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and organize that and creating some recommendations for government to regulate or maybe to organize this data so it could be more accessible, and more open, and more transparent for everyone else. We understand that this is a big challenge for the cities, and we hope that this will create some better decarbonization, civic engagement for the citizen. We also understand that today mayors, they tend to use Facebook or maybe social media to engage with the community, understand the community is very much connected to the social media. However, what some of them don't understand is that once you are opening your municipality or the face of your city for the citizens, you need to have a back office that will allow you to really respond to them, otherwise you're going to lose credibility. In the project we've been submitting, or we've been working in Latin America, we're also creating one area, or maybe one group of people, what we call civic engagement laboratories, laboratories of civic innovation, LIC, where we are having like a team of people that are looking about this different kind of data, different kind of needs in the city, and really understanding and finding new solutions so they can get a better transparency and better engagement with the cities so they can have their voice inside the cities as well. Regarding the question for maybe how we trust institutions, I think he mentioned about democracy and things like that. But at the end of the day, the government, they need to be opening their faces to the people. And people, once they see things happening, they start getting much more credibility, much more confident and trust in the government, assuming that they are able to ask their questions and really receive the answers accordingly.
So I'll take two questions as well. The first one being the one about the disadvantaged communities. I think that is an important topic for us to keep in mind, because getting to smart cities can't be done without being inclusive, without including everyone. It is very easy to focus on those segments, for private sector in particular, that are profitable, etc. But cities that really make it a priority to engage everybody, smart city solutions can really serve for the underserved communities as well. And I think there's many examples of that. I'll give a few. One of them is, for example, disabled, who typically are not the first people we think about in the cities, but there are many ways you can do better. For example, in London, there is an app called Wayfinder that allows visually impaired people to walk through the underground, and who has ever been there knows that it's not an easy thing, but you basically can geolocate exactly where you are, and they tell you exactly where you should walk to go and change your trains. So that can make a big, big difference. In Singapore, similarly, you have Green Man Plus, which is if you have a card of either the elderly or disabled, you can put that on the traffic light, and it gives you more time to cross the street than you standardly would. So that's one example. Another example is really specifically targeting some communities that with special needs. For example, the Santa Clara in California, they have they are targeting the homeless population and use data and analytics to identify the most at-risk people and make sure they get to the shelters first. So it's very much trying to solve a specific problem for them. In New York, they similarly used one of the public services unit uses data to identify at-risk populations at home, and they proactively visit them even without an emergency alert. So basically being thoughtful about where and how you can do data to get and address some of those needs. I think perhaps the biggest opportunity is the aging population, where the adoption is lower, the services are often not as easy for them to use, and I think there is plenty that can be used on at-home care, other kinds of services, allowing people who are retired to participate in the labor market with labor market apps. There is huge amounts of opportunities. So I think we just need to be thoughtful and spend mind share to think about that, and there is a lot that can be done. Very quickly on civic engagement. I love that question. I don't have a great answer. I would love to hear if anybody has a perfect example of a city that has really nailed it. I'll give you 3 different kinds of good progress. One of them, there are some mayors who are very good at this. I think whether it's Calgary or London, I think you have mayors who are very charismatic and do it very well and have a following as a result. There are cities that have systematically used it to crowdsource information. I would say Boston is one where you have seen cities actually get information from 311, for example, whether there are potholes or something like that, or what people feel about any kind of decision they are making. So they're basically very good at crowdsourcers. And then there is the San Francisco Bay Area, where the city is actually somewhat passive, but they have a laissez-faire attitude where the private sector can go and experiment. So a lot of the things that now may be working for the city, like the smart parking, they came from the private sector first. So I think there's different ways. I would love to hear. I think it's a good question. I'll be thinking about that.
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up here, so we might have to discuss blockchain in the next event. But I thought this was really informative, and I learned a lot, and I really just want to thank our speakers for their time and contributions, and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.